There's a particular kind of cold that settles into a mountain cabin before sunrise. The fire dies down overnight, and by the time the first person is up, their breath fogs in the air indoors. You feel it in the floorboards. You feel it in your hands before you've even thought about breakfast. In the Smoky Mountains, families had lived like this for generations. The isolation up there wasn't dramatic, it was just geography. Roads were rough, neighbors were far apart. What you had in the kitchen was what you had. And most meals were built around one simple question. How do you make food last longer than it should? Bean and cornbread supper. Pinto beans were the backbone of the Appalachian table, and they'd been that way since at least the early 1800s. A pot would go on the stove first thing in the morning and cook low and slow all day. That long simmer wasn't about preference. Dried beans needed time, and keeping a fire going all day fit more naturally around farm work than trying to rush a meal at sundown. The cornbread beside it was nothing fancy. Cornmeal, water, a bit of lard if there was any, baked in a cast iron skillet that had been seasoned over years of use. Men came in from the fields, children came in from wherever children go, and everyone sat down to the same thing: beans and bread. It was repetitive, but repetition had value in mountain kitchens. You knew it would fill you up, and you knew the ingredients would probably still be there tomorrow. Fried potato peelings. Wasting food wasn't just frowned upon in mountain communities. It was genuinely unthinkable. Every part of what you grew or bought had a use, and the potato was no exception. The flesh went into stews, or was boiled plain. The skins went into hot grease. Dropped into a skillet with rendered lard, the peelings crisped up fast. A little salt if the family had some. It wasn't really a side dish. It was what you made when there wasn't enough potato left for a full serving. And in kitchens where food ran short near the end of winter, little things like that mattered more than people now realize. Sometimes the person doing the cooking ate them standing at the stove before anyone else sat down. Not out of greed, but because that was just the order of things. Kilt lettuce. By early spring, people were tired of preserved food, tired of salt pork, tired of dried beans, tired of meals that all tasted more or less the same. The word kilt in this context is old Appalachian dialect for killed. What happens to fresh greens when you pour hot fat over them? The leaves wilt down, soften, and take on whatever flavor the grease carries with it. If there was bacon, the drippings from that went over the greens. More often, it was plain rendered lard with a splash of vinegar, added to cut the richness. The bowl got passed around quickly before the dressing soaked in too far and the leaves went limp. For families deep in the mountains, fresh greens after winter carried a kind of relief that's hard to explain now. It turned rough garden greens into something warm and filling alongside cornbread. Simple, but purposeful. Leather britches beans. Some meals weren't really meals at all until winter arrived. Come August, green beans weren't just for eating fresh. They were strung on long pieces of thread with a needle and hung near porches or from rafters through the fall. By the time cold weather settled into the mountains, they'd shrunk down to something leathery and twisted, hence the name. Months later, they could still be hanging in the kitchen long after the garden itself was gone, rehydrated and boiled slowly with onions or a piece of fat back when there was one available. Leather britches were dependable winter food. The flavor deepened as they cooked. Old women sat near the stove, snapping the dried strings apart while talking. It was one of those tasks that got done while hands stayed busy and evenings grew dark outside the windows. Milk gravy over bread. Some dishes existed for one purpose only: to make leftovers feel like supper again. When breakfast grease sat in the skillet and there wasn't enough meat to stretch to evening, a spoonful of flour went in first, then milk or watered down canned milk, or whatever approximation of it was available, stirred until it thickened into something pale and warm. That gravy went over biscuits from the morning that had gone hard, or stale bread nobody wanted to eat plain. It softened both the food and the situation. In some parts of the mountains, it was called poor dew gravy, which is about as honest a name as any dish has ever had. You weren't eating it because it was special. You were eating it because it turned scraps into something hot. Soup beans with chow chow. By February, meals started to blur together. The garden was a memory by then. Fresh food was long gone, and families were living almost entirely off what they'd managed to preserve in the fall. Soup beans came back to the table again and again, and after weeks of eating the same pot, the monotony wore on people. Chow chow solved part of that problem. The relish, made from end-of-season green tomatoes, cabbage, peppers, and whatever else needed to be saved before frost, was put up in jars in September and October. A spoonful over beans added acid, bite, and something that felt almost fresh after months of heavy food. Families kept their jars carefully in root cellars because losing even one jar was something people remembered. Cornmeal mush, cornmeal and water, cooked down until it held its shape. It could be eaten hot and soft in a bowl. Leftover mush was poured into a pan, left to set overnight, then sliced and fried in the morning. 2 meals from one batch. That mattered. A lot of Appalachian cooking worked that way. Food had to keep working after the first meal was over. For children especially, cornmeal mush was filling in a way that carried you through long days of cold and work. The same meal, week after week, without much complaint. Because complaining about food was a luxury nobody could really afford. Poke salad. Every family in the mountains knew which plants on the hillsides were edible and which ones would put you in the ground. Pokeweed, Phytolacca americana, was both. Everyone knew the plant could make you sick if it was handled the wrong way. So the young shoots were boiled once, then boiled again, carefully. The same way older relatives had always done it. The plant came back every spring without fail, cost nothing, and appeared right when winter food stores were running low. In mountain communities, knowledge like that mattered as much as the food itself. Squirrel stew. Small game was never beneath anyone's notice. A squirrel was a thin meal, but in a pot with water, onions, and whatever potatoes were left, it became stew enough to stretch across several bowls if enough liquid was added. And sometimes the broth itself was the important part. Boys learned to sit still in the woods early. Patience wasn't a virtue in the abstract. It was practical. You missed, your family ate less. You waited, you didn't miss. People didn't usually tell stories about meals like this with pride. They just remembered them quietly, the same way they remembered cold winters or bad harvests. Apple stack cake scraps. Not every Appalachian food memory was about hardship. Apple stack cake showed up at funerals, church gatherings, winter visits, and community events across the mountains. Women often arrived carrying individual dried cake layers to be stacked together with cooked apple filling spread between them. The taller the cake, the more people had shown up carrying layers. It was community cooperation made edible. The apples were dried in summer and reconstituted slowly into a thick spiced filling. After the layers sat together overnight, the moisture softened the cake into something almost tender. And after long winters of practical meals and repetition, something sweet carried a different kind of meaning. Ramps and eggs. By the end of winter, fresh food almost stopped feeling real. Then the ramps appeared. Wild ramps, a type of wild leek, pushed out of the ground before almost anything else grew. In the mountains, that timing made them precious. The smell stayed with you for days, in your breath, and even through your skin. But nobody cared much about that. Families gathered ramps together in muddy boots while the ground was still thawing from winter. Cooked with eggs, they became one of the first fresh meals of the year. And after months of dried food, salted meat, and whatever had survived the winter cellar, that first taste of spring mattered more than elegance ever could. Lie hominy. Some Appalachian food traditions carried knowledge people trusted long before they understood the reasons behind it. Dried corn soaked in lye water softened and swelled in the pot, changing into something more nourishing than it had been before. Families kept making hominy the way older generations had taught them, because people who didn't often got sick sooner or later. The knowledge was passed carefully, ratios, timing, texture, signs that it was ready. It wasn't just cooking, it was survival knowledge handed from one generation to the next. Most of these dishes didn't survive prosperity. Once people could buy what they needed without thinking twice, they stopped making the foods that reminded them of when they couldn't. That's understandable. But somewhere in those cold kitchens and those long simmered pots was a kind of knowledge that took generations to build. About patience, about repetition, about using everything, and about making a real meal out of almost nothing. And maybe that's part of why these foods still linger in memory long after the recipes themselves began to disappear.